Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today, I'm joined by John Henry Crosby, founder and president of the von Hildebrand Project. John Henry is a translator, writer, critic, and cultural entrepreneur focused on making available the works of Dietrich von Hildebrand in English and advancing awareness of personalist philosophy. John Henry, welcome to the show.
Josh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course, it is such a pleasure. I always enjoy our conversations. And usually when we talk, we get around to talking about philosophy. And I know you're a big advocate of personalism. I'm sure we'll get into in just a moment. But as I was thinking about our conversation today, I was struck by a passage I recently encountered in C.S. Lewis's autobiography, Surprised by Joy. Now, I don't really always turn to Lewis for personalist philosophy. I mean, he's not Karol Wojtyla, he's not Max Scheler, he's not Dietrich von Hildebrand. He's not one of those folks who really makes the person the central focus of his philosophy. But there was a passage in this book where he had recently been reflecting on his own death. And I was curious, I wanted to get your thoughts on this passage. Here's how he puts it. The fruit of this experience, contemplating his own mortality, was that when some years later I met Kant's distinction between the noumenal and the phenomenal self, it was more to me than an abstraction. I had tasted it. I had proved that there was a fully conscious I, whose connections with the me of introspection were loose and transitory. Well, John Henry, what do you see in that passage? What kind of leaps out at you from that idea?
Well, what leaps out at me is I'm actually reminded of Newman's distinction between real and notional assent. This strong distinction between knowledge in a full-blooded, concrete, experiential sense versus a more abstract knowledge, and of course, at the heart of personalism, broadly understood, there is in a philosophy that emphasizes the nature and the dignity of the person and is intrigued by personal life. There's always a great emphasis on the concrete individual and on the concrete experience of the individual, not necessarily in a relativizing way, but in the sense that there's a recognition of the fact that the individual person has their own direct, concrete connection with reality, and that this is what's necessary for real knowledge, for deep moral commitments, for deep life of faith, for real human relations. So that's what jumps out at me. It's not maybe the main thing that Lewis is trying to say, but that's what I heard in the vis-a-vis our conversation about personalism.
No, I think that's fascinating because there's certainly a temptation for the philosophically inclined to go to such a level of abstraction that the actual concrete experiences seem to not matter at all. I think that was something Lewis spends a lot of time in Surprised by Joy and also in Abolition of Man, are really trying to go back down to that more concrete level and trying to really elevate the importance of the actual experiences that we have as valid as human beings. Well,
yeah, that's right.
Let's back this up a little bit because we're already kind of getting into it. I wonder if you could help us with maybe setting up our conversation this way. What exactly is philosophical anthropology, and why on earth does this matter?
Well, I was thinking about that question since you had posed that to me before. And, maybe the place to begin is to say that the question's a good one. Maybe the term is a bit of a misnomer because philosophical anthropology it can give sort of maybe some of the wrong impressions of something more. I mean, we hear human anthropology and we hear sort of a very different discipline. I think generally philosophical anthropology is a more European, often in sort of the circle around Karol Wojtyla, for example. I think we can safely just speak about the philosophy of the person, the philosophical question of the human person. Maybe the the underlying reason why people like to sometimes express themselves in terms of the philosophical anthropology, and maybe this gets towards the question that you're raising, is the idea that there's a cohesive account of the human person in philosophical terms, not only in scientific, material, neurological, psychological terms, but in a holistic way that looks to the nature of the person. And so you'll hear, for example, in Karol Wojtyla, the expression, the need for an adequate anthropology. And what's meant there is an account of the person that does justice to the person. And so maybe to the core sort of concern, or a core concern about personalism, or a way into what personalism is, one can say that personalists, as a group, a very loose group, because many of them represent different schools and traditions and so on, but they're very concerned with the individual person being understood in adequate terms, not in reductive terms. There's an anti-reductionism at play here. So, for example, when economists think of persons as consumers, or even more nowadays, when everything is reducible into data, or when you have when in the realm of neurobiology, the account of the brain becomes so complete and comprehensive that the temptation is that one has arrived at an interpretation of the person. And maybe even more generally than that, personalism tends to be opposed to a hyper-rationalization of the person seen principally through the intellect, and through his rational powers. And you see this in debates about artificial intelligence. There's sort of this idea that artificial intelligence is going to surpass the person. Well, it might surpass in certain respects computational power, but it's not going to surpass an individual person who is much more, fundamentally more than their powers and capacities. So that should give maybe sort of a sense of the different avenues of attack by which personalists tend to think about issues, and why they're interested in a so-called adequate anthropology.
That's really helpful. I like that phrasing of adequate versus reductive. It seems that there is a lot of temptation to reduce the essence of what it means to be human to really one factor, when what you're describing is that if we're going to have an accurate account of what it means to be human, we actually have to keep all of these different factors in mind and sort of balanced against each other.
That's right.
I'm thinking of conversations I've had with high schoolers that I get them in 11th grade philosophy class. They finished 10th grade biology, and they're taking 11th grade chemistry when I teach them in philosophy. And they are so quick to reduce, they'll willingly reduce happiness to a chemical equation, or they'll reduce what it means to a specific biological understanding. But it seems that we all have this experience that being human is so much more than that.
That's right. Right. Exactly. And even if some of these accounts that we get through, for example, if neurobiology sheds light on the functioning of the brain, and we begin to understand more about how the brain supports these experiences, we're very quick to go from a kind of scientific explanation to the idea that this is really the total account of the experiences. I don't know, if you're looking at the experience of love, and we can identify centers of the brain and the neurochemistry involved. Well, that there's that leap, that reductive leap from that account. It may be necessary, certainly not sufficient, in the accounting of the human person.
Well, I'm thinking there's so much that reductive idea is important there, because sure. It seems to me that if we have a robust understanding of what a person is, that we sort of continually add complexity to our view of the person. If a neurochemist tells me, the feelings I have for my wife are directly related to this section of the brain and could be stimulated through this process or whatever. Well, that's helpful to know, but it certainly doesn't explain to me why Dante fell head over heels in love with Beatrice, or why Shakespeare is able to speak so well, why Shakespeare wrote all of his love sonnets, and or the various characters. It doesn't address the complexity, nor does it speak to what does it take for kind of Kierkegaard's vision of love lasting over a lifetime. And that's right. It may give us a more accurate understanding of part of the human experience, but it doesn't. None of these seem to be the totality.
That's right. No, it's not that. I think maybe there can be a tendency among philosophers, and maybe also with theologians of a certain variety, who want very much to uphold the existence of the soul, the spiritual nature of the person, who find themselves they feel somehow threatened by greater understanding of the physiological nature of the person, particularly in the realm of the brain. But of course, that does not have to happen. I mean, that there's a respect in which welcome all of that. In some sense, also recognize precisely what remains irreducible and mysterious about the person, despite our ever-growing knowledge of the body. So yes, this anti-reductionism, this recognition of the complex, the uniqueness of persons, is a great preoccupation of just about any personalism. The idea that a person is, could be sort of reduced to a category. So, for example, to speak of an individual substance of a rational nature, which is a classic definition of the person. And of course, definitions are moving at the level of abstraction. So, in one sense, there's a legitimacy there. But the personalist would want to also capture, even in general terms, the uniqueness of the person. So they'd want to say that it's a unique and unrepeatable substance of a rational nature, and rational understood as richly as possible, not just in a narrow sense of a kind of computational ability, but also in terms of the rational, the way in which the mind penetrates the emotional life of persons. The emotions are seen not just as parts of the body, but they're essentially parts of our personal life. So all of that goes into what a personalist would want to factor into their account of human persons.
So part of what we're always looking for on the Optimistic Curmudgeon are ways to kind of see more truth in the world, and particularly to kind of clarify complicated areas where it's easy to be misled or distracted. And so I wonder if you could kind of help situate that. Now there's a couple that come to my mind pretty quickly. I mean, I think and we've already kind of hinted at some of these. Some people tend to view the human being in terms of a purely materialistic sense. Others kind of get to this sort of purely spiritual, doesn't quite get it. I like your phrase hyper rational, but like purely intellect, where being human is all about the life of the mind, and we happen to inhabit these meat sacks, and the meat sacks might be interchangeable. And maybe some of the sci-fi movies and books about, we can just we can somehow extract the self and put it into a new, improved body, and so on.
Yeah.
In what way is personalism trying to really clarify a particular vision of the person, in contrast to maybe other philosophical understandings of what a person is, or a human is? I feel like I keep using the word person in like 3 or 4 different ways.
Well, that's right. And one thing that personalists will immediately distinguish or try to lend clarity to through distinctions are their basic terms. So, for example, the term person is often in our contemporary culture more or less exchangeable for the term individual, right? This individual, that individual could be a reasonable substitute. You can complete many sentences by using both terms. But of course, that's not the sense in which personalists use the term person. Obviously, a person is an individual being, but it's much more than that. For example, persons want to affirm always the relational nature of persons, right? And that's not captured in the idea of an individual. That a person finds their fulfillment at the level of their nature, to speak in more traditional language, in the relations that they form to others, the relations that they come into from the very moment of their being. In a religious context, you would say the relationship to God is established immediately. Certainly, the relationship to the mother is established immediately. So one has to be careful, as you say, with the sort of the inherent ambiguities in some of the terms that are used. So you mentioned some of the problematic philosophies that are out there that you might say offer competing visions for the person. But you also said that you're interested in this podcast in you might say finding the truth in ideas that are out there. In other words, I think that's the meaning of an optimistic curmudgeon. There's plenty to be critical about, but there are real truths to be seen.
There are truths that are. I mean, we need answers to these questions. I think it's one of the reasons that philosophy never really gets old if you really understand the question. Like we need to understand what we are and what the nature of the world, so that we have any possibility of finding happiness in this life. And so there are true answers out there. And part of what I hope to do with this show is talk to people who have great insight in particular areas. And so that's what we're all about on this show, is figuring out, like, okay, so what's what's true. And usually it's easier to see what's true in contrast to what's false.
So in the title of the podcast, The Optimistic Curmudgeon, there's obviously a focus on those things in the ideas and in the broader culture that you want to critique, but there's a recognition that there may be at times truths to be harvested, even in unlikely places. And I think that personalism is very interesting in this respect because maybe at some basic level it's because personalism tends to be good at sustaining apparent contradictions, not literal contradictions. It's not relativistic, but the fact that we are matter and spirit, body and soul, conscious and sort of subconscious, the fully conscious and the subconscious, and on and on. There's a lot of mystery in our being, and so personalism, that precisely that non-reductive element that we started our conversation with, will lead a good personalist philosopher to not want to sort of explain things out of the picture that are inconvenient for the theory, but to sort of hold them all in tension. So when I think about the world in which we find ourselves, I mean, there are all sorts of tendencies. They may not always even be schools of thought or clear ideas, but there are certainly tendencies in which the person is inadequately thought of. So, for example, we tend very much to objectify the body. I am myself, my consciousness. The body is more an object or a tool. It could be a tool for my plans and projects in the world. It can be a tool for seeking pleasure. It can be a tool for a lot of things. And there are all sorts of ethical implications too, because people will sometimes say, well, it's not what I do with my body, it's it's the intentions that I may have that define my moral character. So, for example, in the sexual sphere, that you can imagine how that just opens things up. There's not much that you can't do without, I don't know, consent, maybe. Sure. And in the personalist account, the body is much more is seen in a much more integral relationship to the person. And I'm putting aside kind of, technical distinctions between body and soul, but, that ordinary experience that we have of being a self, a center of thinking and willing and wanting and so on, feeling, and then the body that we're all in. And the personalist would want to say, no, the body is not reducible. I'm not reducible to my body. I'm not just a body. I am a body, but I also have a body. There's a certain distance between me and my body as well. And that creates, a much more complex picture. So the response maybe to Cartesian dualism is not just, a kind of materialist knee-jerk reaction. It's a recognition of the fact that perhaps Descartes did see something, that this whole turn to the subject, as it's often referred to in the history of philosophy, that's what defines modernity, right? It's this turn to the subject, the discovery of the personal subject, that this is, on the one hand, a problematic account of persons, but it's also a significant and unavoidable account. Personalists, modern personalism really can't be made much sense of without this turn to the subject. Now, they want to integrate that into a more holistic account of the person as embodied in their body, and they want to see the moral life not just in such a way that the body is sort of the object of whatever we want to do with it, provided we're not hurting anyone or causing injury, but that what we do with our bodies reflects on our moral being. So that's just one example, or one mode of reflection on embodiment. As a something on the one hand that is very problematic in the world. When we think about, for example, I think the dominant image of the human person in the world today has probably shifted from the ghost in the machine of Descartes to perhaps the computer hard drive. Mm-hmm. Person is somehow a collection of sort of thoughts, experiences, memories, maybe loosely united around some changing, malleable subject. And then this is what sort of, plays into this, this fantastical view, that, human beings are basically the content of the brains. And so we can be downloaded into other brains or uploaded into computer systems. This whole transhumanist movement, which in its extremes, still shocks people, but in its, sort of in its impact on the ordinary imagination, we do tend to think in terms of, when something is slow in coming, we say it's not on the screen yet, or I need to get that into my RAM, so I have it present to mind. So So that would be an example of a another sort of dominant image or paradigm that personalism would find probably more fault with than not, and maybe at the same time recognize some very limited truths in it. But that shows you how ideas about who we are, maybe they flow from or are animated by philosophers and scientists and so on. But a lot of it just has a way of flowing into the culture, and many people end up adopting this self-image without ever having read a word of philosophy, right? But these ideas are informative of the culture.
Now, everything you're describing, I think, is part of why I find personalism so intriguing and fascinating. Is I think you're right. There are plenty of philosophical ideas that sort of float out into pop culture. One I thought of as you were describing the kind of RAM and the way people think about the self as sort of a computer program inside a machine that is the body, that kind of thing. I don't know if you're familiar with a science fiction show that lasted 2 seasons. It was a Joss Whedon show called Dollhouse, but it features.
I never saw it.
Yeah. I love the show, but I'm not going to officially say it's a great show that everyone should rush out to watch, but it plays with that sort of idea. And it also, I think, ties into something else you were talking about. It also kind of pushes on the pretty evident limits of consent as an ethical principle, because of course there's, I think it's part of where personalism pushes back, because if every person does have a certain sort of dignity, then I actually cannot ethically consent to the violation of my own dignity. This is where I think personalism has a strong answer to why is suicide wrong? Why is euthanasia wrong? Because if consent is our highest good, if it's our highest principle of moral reasoning, well, then there's really no reason I cannot consent to killing myself. And Dollhouse kind of plays with some of that as a show, because the conceit of the show is that there's an underground business that where if you get in terrible trouble, you can sign up to be an employee of this business, and you give them 5 years of your life, and you go to sleep and you wake up 5 years later. What actually happens in those 5 years is that your brain, your personality, yourself is taped onto a disc, and they can load you with different traits and personalities, and you're rented out to clients for different excursions and so on.
Yeah.
Now,
that's fascinating.
That's as deep as the philosophy goes. It doesn't do anything
but that's
more.
Fascinating, because as a kind of thought experiment, maybe it helps us to see the lengths to which some of these ideas might go. And hopefully these are not experiments that are attempted, but unfortunately, to the extent that science achieves these things, someone will probably try to achieve them. So who knows? I mean, the risk, of course, of a pure sort of literary exploration of these things is that you maybe don't. I mean, maybe some people have some kind of moral reaction, abhorrence, or something like that when they read these things. But the challenge, of course, is that it may be more fascinating than abhorrent, and so people may not, without some moral reflection, see that. But you make a very interesting point too about the way in which dignity, tends to work in the modern world. We tend to think of dignity as something that allows us to sort of deflect the claims of others, that particularly claims that violate our freedom and our consent. But the idea that our dignity makes claims on ourselves is probably a foreign concept, right? Because within the logic of consent, I mean, if I, what's to prevent me from killing myself, or committing all sorts of other.
You raised it already. I mean,
bodily harm.
The biggest area that I think we see this in today's society is the question of sexual ethics. I mean, I think there was a headline yesterday of a politician who was found in a BDSM dungeon, and that shocks people. But it shocks people because we do have I would argue it's probably rooted in a natural law conscience that people still have, whether they would openly admit that or not. But it shocks people to think that a public official would do that. But if your highest reasoning is consent, well, he consented to whatever was being done to him. I mean, that's right. That's right. Yeah,
these are not principled objections. They're maybe like lingering moral feelings about what's appropriate. But the reality is that culturally we don't really those are really social norms, I think, more than they are. Now, it depends on the person and also on where you are. Maybe there are more conservative, morally conservative, or religiously committed people in parts of the world. But but I agree with you that it's certainly the degree to which kind of the standards that we're willing to uphold public officials, they don't encompass much more than consent, because it's hard, in the sort of relativistic society that we're in, to do that.
That's it. I mean, it requires we have to actually have some sort of agreement, which we currently lack and have lacked for, I don't know how long, maybe since the fall. We have lacked an agreement on the nature of the good and what constitutes a violation. But that might be a good transition point to a different question. I think part of
Sure.
I consider myself a dabbler in philosophy. I think you do a lot more formal philosophy than I do, but it's always seemed to me that there is a strong connection between the philosophical system that someone upholds and the ethical views that they espouse, and what's connected to that. Seems like ethics, I think, flow from philosophy. What you think people are and the world is, and how purposes work, and the nature of metaphysics to material reality, and so on. All of that then results in a set of actions. So all of that, then I want to kind of like, what does personalism have to say towards questions of ethics and right behavior? How does personalism speak into that? If we follow you on this idea of each human being is an unrepeatable rational substance that has some quality we're terming dignity, what does that look like in practice?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting and maybe worth underscoring that personalism, both as a philosophy and to the extent that personalism is often sort of an inspiring force in social movements or in social thought, tends to take its point of departure in ethics. I think that's not accidental. In other words, when you have this this particularly noble and exalted vision of the human person, there will be consequences in terms of how personalism thinks that persons should be treated. And I think the other reason that personalism often begins in ethics is because often personalism arises out of the perception of particularly grievous evils committed against persons. So when you imagine, and so for example, there are a lot of 20th century personalism is articulated in the face of totalitarianism and the totalitarian regimes, and all of the different forms of depersonalization, not just the mass killing of people, but the discrimination against people, for example, for their religious beliefs or for their race. And then, of course, you in today's world, you often hear the expression soft totalitarianism. It's not necessarily the gulag, but there are all sorts of ways in which, one hears the expression, the throwaway culture that we live in, that persons are discardable. And this is part of what happens when you're a mere consumer, right? If your dignity is not much greater than that. So personalism, both responds to cases of depersonalization. It has a very sort of highly tuned faculty for detecting forms of depersonalization, both the most egregious forms and also the more subtle forms. And on the other hand, personalism is it's somehow circular, or it's a feedback loop, I think, between sort of the perception of moral evils committed against persons, and by the same token, an ever deepening sensitivity for the dignity of the person. So that's I guess how I would address this question of personalist ethics. More to speak for a moment in slightly more historical terms. I mean, personalists will often speak of persons as ends in themselves, which is a phrase that we have from Kant. Person is an end in himself, never a mere means. That doesn't mean persons can't be means in some respects. Never a mere means, right? We can't be reducible to simply the means of the projects and desires of others, and of course, we shouldn't be, reducible to the as mere means, even to our own intentions and projects. There are ways of not treating ourselves as persons either. And so, in philosophical terms, you get the heritage out of Kant on persons as ends and not means is very, very significant. And lots of issues can be thought through that lens. It's not the sum total of all ethical principles. Personalists will will attend to. For example, in that phrasing of Kant, you don't have an explicit account of the uniqueness of persons, right? And so a personalist ethics is going to bring together a variety of these things. You'll speak of uniqueness, you'll speak of other categories that are often appealed to are another category would be the idea of subjectivity, not subjectivism, but the idea that the person has an inner life, an inner awareness, an inner space, and a lot of important things happen in that space, right? Even the interpersonal space between persons requires an interior space, certainly in love relationships. And then, personalists are very interested in philosophy of religion. And so the idea that this space is also the room in which the encounter between the person and the divine, the human person and the divine takes place. All of those are part of the account that personalists give. But, you had asked about ethics. And so, I think it's worth simply underscoring that much of personalism in some sense begins in ethical questions, and then it works itself into other areas. When their personalists are indeed very interested in questions of metaphysics and questions of aesthetics and on and on. But they've taken, there's a kind of point of departure in the recognition of the ethical being, the moral being, and the claims that flow from the moral being of persons.
Your answer to that reminds me of a question that was posed to Russell Kirk once. He had, after he had written The Conservative Mind, someone, I don't know if it was a reporter or a college student, but somebody asked him, so what exactly do conservatives vote for? And Kirk was thrown by that because for him, conservatism was not about a list of policies that he was advocating for. Instead, it was more about a disposition, and it was working out this sort of disposition of mind in practical terms. But the practical terms were always going to be particular and contextualized. And he kind of hated the idea of like, well, to be a conservative means you affirm limited taxes and you only vote for this kind of person. And he thought that was ridiculous. A part of what I'm hearing in your answer is that ethics is very, very important for personal philosophy, but it's not as simple as the idea that these actions are necessarily right and these actions are necessarily wrong and we're done, but rather it's a matter of how do we apply these convictions about human dignity and relationality and unrepeatable uniqueness to whatever circumstances arise. So it strikes me as like there's a dynamic ethic there rather than a fixed, settled ethic. Is that accurate?
Well, I want to affirm the idea of a dynamic ethic in the sense that there's a strong recognition of the fact that ethical experience arises out of the concrete experience of life. We don't begin with a set of abstract principles, but I think you'll find that most of the great significant personalists, certainly out of the European circles, people like Max Scheler and Hildebrand and Karol Wojtyla and Romano Guardini and on and on and on, that they would affirm, to put it in sort of terms that they probably wouldn't use, but something like exceptionalist norms or universal moral principles of action. That, for example, that expression of Kant that persons are ends in themselves and never mere means. I mean that's a properly philosophical principle, you might say. Now, how that looks in all of the different permutations of our dealings between persons, that isn't answered, in every instance by the principle. I mean, the principle requires a recognition, but on the other hand, I think personalists tend to have a pretty high sensibility for how that ends up looking. So, if they'll see the risk of depersonalization. So, to give a very specific example, like in the workplace, personalism would be very concerned with, of course, the dignity of all persons involved, but certainly the dignity of the worker, the employee, and they would recognize that there are inherent risks in the employer-employee relationship. They're not going to say that this is like a fundamentally flawed or an impossible relationship, or that, they're not going to take a kind of, collectivist turn by any means, but they will recognize that there are risks there and that the employer needs to be sure that he isn't acting in such a way that the employee is completely reduced to their function, right? And that they're in fact, at the deepest level, the employer and the employee are both persons, and that the interaction between them is the interaction between persons. It's not like personhood can be suspended, and that therefore the employer, with an employer with a strong sense of the personhood of his employees will treat them differently, or will be aware of certain risks and tendencies. Does that mean that the employer won't have to make hard decisions? No, but it might mean that they think differently about those decisions. Maybe they draw the employee more into the decision-making process, or allow the employee to, impart, suggest a solution. So, you can sort of imagine what happens when this sense of the dignity and the uniqueness of every person sort of begins to be felt strongly by people.
Mhm.
David Brooks tells a story. I think it's in his book, his most recent book which is called The Second Mountain. It's on my shelf here somewhere. No, it's actually at home. But he speaks about, and I think it's in that book, he speaks about an experience, I think, of being in Penn Station in New York, and having an almost mystical experience, of suddenly seeing this crowd of people as immortal souls, are as unique individuals with
moral life.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, it's an overwhelming experience, and it doesn't mean, again, that all human relations can always happen at that highest level of interpersonal life, but to realize, very potently in certain moments that, you're always dealing with persons, or as C.S. Lewis says in The Weight of Glory, right? There is no such thing as a mere mortal, right? You're always dealing with future,
Oh,
what does he say? Angels and demons, or gods and goddesses.
I mean, every person you've ever met is either an eternal God with little g in the making, or an eternal devil in the making.
Yeah.
And if we could see the glory or horror that we are all headed towards, I'm paraphrasing, but I think he says something like, it would literally, like, either one would, like, literally melt our faces off. And then he's like, and all that.
That's right. Yeah, he said, I think you would be you would be sorely tempted to fall in worship of the divinized, person, human being in heaven. So that, that of course is an eschatological view to the,
Mhm.
to the other side, as it were. But, the reality is that, that's the nature of our being. And personalists have a very strong sense of that, and want to preserve that when they think through even the most prosaic of, issues of fairness and sort of the daily interactions between human beings. But just to go back to one thing, since you asked about, you mentioned human sexuality, maybe in our previous segment, but to the issue of to the sort of the personalist account of the body. Personalists, I said before that, for the personalist, I'm not just some self inside of a body in that Cartesian sense. I am my body in one respect. I also have my body. I'm not reducible to my body. So they recognize that tension, but the body is seen not just as, like even a closely aligned, object that happens to be sort of my possession throughout my life. The body is seen as the person, and also essentially expressive of the person, right? So the body, and not just in the sense that I can choose to express myself when I smile or I frown. Now, I think personalists want to say that there's something like essential in a smile to joy and happiness that is not essential to a frown, right? And that's a debate, right? And one can have that debate. But I don't think you're going to find many personalists who want to say that, a smile is a mere social convention. There might be social elements, to a smile, and when and how one smiles. But the personalist would want to say that in the very structure of our embodiment, particularly in our sexuality, is, an indication of our nature. So now it's so fashionable to treat, the what we call the sex of our birth, in distinction to our gender. But for a personalist, a personalist can certainly recognize gender dysphoria and acknowledge that it's a serious, maybe intractable problem in someone's life. But that will not lead a personalist to conclude that, men and women as embodied in our male and female bodies are, sort of that this is somehow merely accidental to our nature. There's this idea that this reflects our very being, and in particular in the thought of someone like von Hildebrand, and maybe even more so in the thought of Karol Wojtyla, John Paul II. John Paul II has this powerful expression, the nuptial meaning of the body. He reads into the very physiology and let's just say the physical and also the psychological experience of the body, that nuptial structure, that is to say, the fundamental orientation of man and woman to each other in love and in marriage. Now, that's of course an account that in our world today requires absolutely a theological foundation. You're going to find plenty of sympathetic personalists who want to honor the embodied nature of the person who are not going to go that far. But it's maybe worth saying in this moment that in many of the personalisms that we're talking about here, these are both philosophical and theological accounts that grow out of religious traditions. And so they draw on those resources. So in the Christian context, you're drawing on scripture and on the whole tradition of Christian theology. You have something similar in the Jewish world. They're, fairly distinctive Jewish personalisms. Even if that is not the, in every respect, the part of personalism that is most accessible in a kind of public setting, I think we would be doing a disservice to our conversation here to sort of pretend that there aren't these much stronger, thicker claims about persons and personal life that come out of the context of a Christian or Jewish personalism.
I mean, that just takes us back to, Genesis 1 is very clear that, where God says, let us make man in our image, male and female, he created them. I think the Genesis account does not leave masculinity and femininity out in the realm of accidental features that are changeable. It's right. It's the claim of historic Christianity, and I would assume some level of Orthodox Judaism, but I don't know enough about the contemporary landscape of Judaism to.
Well, yeah, in Judaism, of course, you've got like in Christianity, you've got that very broad arena. Among Orthodox Jews, there's a strong acceptance of that Genesis account and very rich interpretation of that is actually very sympathetic to people like Hildebrand and John Paul II. That strong sense of being embodied. There's, in fact, in Jewish thought, to speak very generally, and I would defer to my Jewish friends here, there's a much more diminished tendency towards dualism. That's maybe in some sense, there's maybe a greater tendency of that in Jewish thought. In Christian thought to sort of distinguish between the spiritual and the material dimensions of the person, and maybe in Jewish thought there's a greater integration of those two. But basically, I think one can speak, up to a certain point of a Judeo-Christian account of the body that is richly developed in personalism and in Christian and in Jewish personalism.
So, I think that's a fascinating view of to really uphold the body and to uphold masculinity and femininity as essential rather than accidental. I think we've moved. Culture today has moved so fast. From just even over the last 6 years, from 2015 with the Obergefell decision to 2021, the transgender movement has moved at lightning speed to seemingly become normalized in American society. But I think that's it upholds this idea that those are very accidental. I appreciate the way you kind of phrase that. Gender dysphoria, if I heard you correctly, you would recognize, and the personalist you're referring to would recognize gender dysphoria as a disorder, as a sickness of the mind in some way.
Well, I think yes, and I think they would. Many of them would argue for it, and I say that because I think, first of all, many of the classic personalists, this wasn't an issue remotely on their minds. It would have been more sort of tendencies to commodify the body and so on that animated Hildebrand and Wojtyla and others. So, we're in a whole new world with transgenderism and transhumanism and so on. But I think it absolutely flows from the kind of basic principles and commitments that they have to the embodied nature of the person and the whole account of sexuality in those personalist thinkers, that they would view gender dysphoria as a kind of I think I think they would differ in the sense that there may be a tendency sometimes for people to explain away people. In other words, Christians who want to affirm, the biblical account of male and female sexuality, perhaps are tempted to just explain away or find other explanations for what gender dysphoria claims to be. And I think among many personalists, because of this, there's a strong phenomenological bent. They don't want to just pretend that certain things aren't there. They would say, no, this can be very much an experience that people have. and of course they would consider it an experience that flows somehow out of an account of human brokenness. And now what they would, how they would go about healing and resolving problems of gender dysphoria, I think it's not entirely clear to me, because it's not clear to me whether there's a consistent personalist account yet. I know of personalists who are thinking and writing about this, but it's perhaps more somehow emerging. But nothing. I'm just trying to sort of give a sense of the fact that two things. Number one, the kind of core personalist principles around embodiment would, I think, almost require someone to see gender dysphoria as not just like some neutral fact that we can work with, right, and then we're just going to sort of let people, decide what they're going to be in terms of their the gender that they want reflected in their body, and then the gender roles that they want to carry out. But on the other hand, I think that it's still a field where it will be very interesting to see how personalists argue for and think about the issues like gender dysphoria. I think also sort of transhumanism broadly, these questions of the body and the I know I have friends who are thinking about this image of the body as a kind of the person as a computer, and how this affects our thinking about ourselves. So, but all of it at the end of the day, is really rooted in let's call it the incarnational personalism that we get in our personalist thinkers, and it's maybe a matter of working out how those sort of core insights and principles allow us to address these very current issues that are ongoing.
Oh, yeah, I think it's the cutting edge right now of like where people are trying to figure out what is. I mean, what literally exists. What is reality? Where is reality? Where is experience? And do those align, or do they differ from each other? So I think you've given us some helpful thoughts to think about that. And I think one of all throughout this conversation, it occurs to me that I think part of what personalism upholds is some of the most interesting things that are not destructive in postmodern thought, in terms of a postmodern appreciation of mystery, a recognition of the limitation of how much we know and even how much we can know, a respect for the subjectivity of human experience. But also personalism seems to hold where postmodern thinkers tend to cut off the tradition, the Western canon, what C.S. Lewis called the Tao. Personalism seems to do both. It's like, okay, we're going to respect the fact that there are all of these things that Descartes and Hume were probably wrong about. Immanuel Kant got these things right, but he was wrong about these things. And yet also cling tightly to Plato and Aristotle and Aquinas and all the rest, and kind of bring all of that to the present to attempt to articulate this is what it means to be human. So I think personalism is a fascinating way of kind of thinking through philosophy in the present day. I appreciate your willingness to come think on the show with us about all of this today.
Well, I think I think that's a very, very good summary of some key personalist categories, ideas, and the respect in which personalism is both able to, let's just say personalism, given its basic commitments, is capable, as you say, of it makes itself amenable, so to speak, to we don't generally think of postmodernism, for example, as all that compatible with traditional views, but to the extent that it forces a deepening, or it reminds us, for example, to the extent that there's an anti-rationalism that it wants to resist. And you have this, of course, in Nietzsche and others, right? This idea that we can know everything. There's a strong pushing back against that, and of course that comes very close to the best Christian sensibilities about the reality of mystery and the mysteriousness of God and the world of revelation, and also the mysteriousness of every human person. The fact that human persons are in some sense inexhaustible is something that personalism is very attuned to. And so Yeah, so it makes for sort of unusual and interesting alliances, intellectually speaking, because there's a deep rootedness and respect for the tradition. It's very McIntyrean in that sense. Personalism is very much in debate with its own past, all the way to the beginning. And at the same time, personalism is, at least in the form that it takes today, in the thinkers that we have identified as important personalists, that personalism is inseparable from being an expression, a philosophical, and even an expression of the imagination that is also distinctively modern. You can't just sort of apply the label personalism to even our own earlier chapters and say that these earlier chapters say everything that a contemporary personalist would want to say and affirm. You need the resources of modernity, but you also need much thicker resources around metaphysics and anthropology and theology than you often have in the present. So I think, but at the end of the day, personalism is. I'll appeal here to von Hildebrand, who one of his sort of ongoing critiques in general of the history of philosophy is the excessive tendency to systemization. We need a comprehensive total system. And of course, to the extent that reality is ordered and structured and even teleological, if you want to go that far, and I think Hildebrand would certainly recognize the idea of real natures at work in the world. Then you, if you recognize that, then there's going to be a tremendous structural dimension to reality. But personalism, on the other hand, is quite willing to accept reality as given, and not everything is reducible to system, or in the end, you need multiple systems. So in that sense, personalism is very, and that goes back to the beginning of the conversation. Personalism is not reductive. It does not want to explain away or reduce to simpler principles what experience, and not just my experience, but human experience in a richer way gives us. So yeah, no, I'm personally, as you can imagine, quite convinced that personalism is a crucial and indispensable voice today, and I'm delighted that you've given me the chance to get together and chat with you about it, and look forward to many more conversations in the future, as I know you and I will continue to talk.
I am confident we will. I was thinking in a world where it seems like decisions are consistently made and trumpeted through utilitarian approaches, through policy concerns that are about achieving some specific goal, in the absence of considering who the people are who are going to be affected by that policy, or a world that seems convinced that human nature is infinitely permeable. I find it very refreshing to spend an hour thinking about how do we study reality and how do we try and grasp the complete totality of what it means to be human. So this has been a wonderful conversation. John Henry, as we wrap up today, where can people find and follow your work online?
Well, they can come to our website, hildebrandproject.org, which is and there's a new website to come, which will be even substantially more representative of our work. So that will be coming probably more in the fall of 2021. They can also follow us on social media. Facebook is probably the main place where they can find our videos of all of our summer seminars and many of our public events, lectures, book launches, and so on. And for those who are inclined to do a little bit of reading in Van Hildebrand or in this personalist tradition, during COVID, we began and will retain a program of online reading groups, which people are welcome to. They're always ongoing and on different books and at different levels, and they're simply open to anyone who's interested. So if people are interested in that, they can find out about that on our website. And so someone who wanted to read a particular book by Van Hildebrand or one of our distinguished personalist authors would have a chance to do it. And these are all guided by associated scholars of the Hildebrand Project. So they're not, by that, I don't mean to say they're advanced, but they're led by people who really know the books and can lead a good discussion. So I invite your listeners to sample all of those good things. And I don't know when your episode will air, but we are weeks away from our 11th annual summer seminar, which will be virtual, which is open access. People just go to our website. And of course, if this episode airs after July 5th through 9th, then they can access all of that archived on our website, and particularly on our YouTube channel. I should have mentioned that all of our video is on our YouTube channel. So that's a lot of answers, basically go to our website, go to Facebook. There's a lot of stuff
Excellent.
there for people interested in personalism.
So that's the hildebrandproject.org, and people can find everything there, links to all of the pages, and can find all kinds of information. That's fantastic. Well, John Henry, thank you so much for coming on the show today to talk with me about personalism and hopefully an optimistic view of human nature. Thank you, listeners, for joining us today for another episode of the Optimistic Curmudgeon. If you like this episode, please leave us a 5-star review and share it with your friends. Until next time, seek the good, discover the true, and love the beautiful. You've been listening to another conversation on the Optimistic Curmudgeon. If you like what you've heard today, please leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcasting platform. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at optimisticcurmudgeon2021@gmail.com. You can find us on all major social media sites. I'll list 3. We're on Twitter at OptimisticC3, on Instagram at OptimisticCurmudgeon2021, and Facebook at facebook.com/the-optimistic-curmudgeon. You can find our show notes, guest bios, and all episodes stored on our website, optimisticcurmudgeon.org. Until next time, seek the good, love the true, and pursue the beautiful.